Is there a doctor on board? The flight attendant's panicked voice echoed through the plane as I was flying back to my hometown. I turned around and saw an elderly woman collapsed in her seat behind me. However, I hesitated to raise my hand. Until recently, I was known as God's Hand, but now rumors of my bad reputation have been spreading in an amusing way. I, who was chased out of the medical community, may not have the right to help her. Then, from somewhere else, a middle-aged man raised his hand and approached, saying, "I'm a doctor." I was relieved, but when I saw the doctor's incorrect treatment, I hurriedly blurted out, I'm also a doctor, sort of. When I grow up, I want to marry a doctor." It was when we were in elementary school that my childhood friend said that. "Why a doctor?" My mom said if you marry a doctor, you'll be set for life. At the time, I didn't know what set for life meant, but I thought that if I became a doctor, I could marry her. I'll become a doctor, and when that time comes, I'll confess my feelings to her. Since then, I began studying hard to get into medical school. However, I, who didn't have particularly good grades, suddenly declared one day that I would become a doctor. The people around me were exasperated and didn't take me seriously, saying keep your jokes to your face. Even my parents, far from supporting or rejoicing, tried to persuade me earnestly. They told me how difficult it is to become a doctor, and that it's a thorny path even with extraordinary effort and intelligence. But I ignored the voices around me and desperately continued studying. Of course, the days of studying were sometimes painful, but I didn't hate learning in the first place, and I had a big motivation to marry my first love. There was no such thing as giving up for me, and eventually, my efforts paid off, and I was accepted into one of the top medical schools on my first try, without having to repeat a year. My parents and relatives were really surprised by this. "I always thought you could do it if you tried," some uncles said, but I didn't particularly care about that. Amid congratulations from those around me, I took this opportunity to move to New York and start living on my own. What I realized after becoming a doctor was that, although my reason for aspiring to be one was simple, the medical profession turned out to be a good fit for me. As soon as I started working as a resident, I demonstrated my talent, appropriate treatment, surgical response, and calm judgment. I became a presence that was respected not only by my peers but also by professors and doctors. And after completing my residency, I felt a sense of purpose in surgery, which deals with particularly high-urgency patients, and decided to specialize in surgery. "Sir, the director is calling for you." It was a nurse who peeked through the door of the examination room. At her words, I woke up with a start and came to my senses. It seemed I had dozed off during a short break due to fatigue. A summons from the director at such timing. "Ethan, what kind of dream were you having?" The familiar nurse laughed as if to say, "I know you were napping. You caught me. It was a dream from when I was a kid. I wanted to be recognized by my first love, so I aspired to be a doctor." "Oh, you're quite pure-hearted, aren't you, Ethan? What happened to your first love?" "She already married another man." "Yes, in the end I couldn't even date my childhood friend, who was the impetus for me to become a doctor. I had planned to propose after becoming a doctor, but a few years after graduating from university, I received a wedding invitation from her with another man. Thus, I experienced heartbreak without even confessing. Unfortunately, even with my skills, I couldn't cure the wounds of heartbreak." "Oh, Ethan, with your current status, you could marry any woman." "Don't worry, I'm married to my job." Cracking a joke, I left the examination room and headed to the director's office. The heartbreak was painful, but by that time I was already absorbed in the fascination of medicine. I felt a sense of purpose in saving people's lives and being thanked for it. I intended to dedicate my life to this job. As I gained more experience over the years, I surpassed the titles of my senior doctors, who were a generation older, before I knew it. And now, at the age of 37, I had somehow become known as a genius neurosurgeon, with a reputation for being one of the best in the country. Perhaps because I had become too famous, I apparently had an embarrassing nickname God's Hand on an online hospital review site. Especially in the past few years, patients from all over the country have been flocking to me every day due to reviews and word of mouth. The patient I had just examined until a moment ago had undergone a major surgery last week, but their progress was going well. If I hadn't been able to have surgery with you, who knows what would have happened to me by now. You truly are a genius, just as the rumors say. God's hand, they said tearfully, and while I was happy they had recovered, I had a hard time calming them down. Because of that, I was a little tired today, but I couldn't ignore a summons from the director I respected. The director of this hospital, Dr. Miller, is a person of integrity whom I respect the most. He recognized my abilities as a young doctor and promoted me. Not only that, he has even promised me the position of the next director. As I walked down the hallway, I passed by a nurse. "Oh, Jennifer." Jennifer, a young female nurse, shuddered. "Good timing." About the chart for the patient in room 101. As I gave work instructions, I noticed something strange about Jennifer's demeanor. She had a frightened look and averted her eyes from me, and on her ears were dull gold, expensive-looking earrings, which were unusual for a nurse. And after listening to my instructions, Jennifer hurried away without making eye contact with me even once. Did I offend her? I muttered to myself at her curt attitude. Indeed, I had surpassed others as a fast-rising star. Some of my seniors didn't think well of me, especially the director's son, Nate, and his clique despised me like a snake. Although he relied on his position as the director's son and lacked ability, it was probably because I had been decided as the next director over him. However, while I was disliked by some doctors, I thought I had built a generally good relationship with the nurses. I only had work-related conversations with Jennifer on a regular basis, and I didn't remember doing anything to make her dislike me. While thinking about her, I headed to the director's office. As soon as I entered the director's office, I noticed an unusual atmosphere. In the spacious room, there was Dr. Miller sitting at his desk, and his son Nate lounging beside him. The moment I entered the director's office, Nate's accusing gaze pierced through me. "Excuse me." And then, I heard a mosquito-like voice from behind me. When I turned around, it seemed that Jennifer, the nurse I had just met, had come in, but her face was pale as if she were being sent to the gallows. Did something happen? After looking at her, I asked Dr. Miller directly. Just as Dr. Miller, with a calm expression, was about to say something, Nate standing next to him raised his voice and said, "Did something happen? Don't play dumb. The evidence is already here." Huh? What did I do? I had no idea what he was talking about. "Look at this." Nate grabbed a stack of papers on the director's desk and threw them at me. There was no way I could catch them in time, and a bundle of documents scattered on the floor. "Nate." Dr. Miller admonished Nate, but his voice lacked its usual forcefulness. I had no choice but to bend my knees and pick up one of the scattered documents. Looking around, I saw X-ray images and what appeared to be prescriptions on the floor as well. The sheet I picked up seemed to be a medical record, a printout of an electronic medical chart. The patient's elegant name, Kelly, rang a bell. If I recalled correctly, it was a patient who had passed away before surgery, mentioned in a hospital meeting handout. It was a very simple case, but apparently, she met a much earlier death than expected. I remember thinking that if I had been the one operating, I could have saved her. However, my eyes stopped at the attending physician field on the chart. There was my name. "Today, we received a complaint from that patient's granddaughter. From the family." Nate said arrogantly. "You tampered with the medicine, didn't you? You threw away the real medicine and prescribed a placebo to hasten that patient's death." A placebo is a fake medicine, meaning a fake drug with no effect. I finally understood the situation. I was currently being suspected as the culprit who drove this patient to her death. You think I would do such a thing? I wasn't even in charge of this patient in the first place. Hey, don't lie." Nate pointed to the documents scattered on the floor with a triumphant look. "Both the chart and the prescriptions were entered from your account. And there's even an eyewitness. An eyewitness to a crime that never even happened." The one who stepped forward in front of me as I grew irritated was Jennifer, the nurse. Jennifer avoided my gaze, trembling. I saw it. It was on March 10th. You were asked by the patient's family and promised to hasten her time of death in exchange for a large sum of money. I widened my eyes at the unexpected words. "Jennifer, why are you telling such a lie? I absolutely never did such a thing. As a doctor, I save people's lives, but would I ever cause someone's death? In the first place, on March 10th, I was at a conference." How unsightly. Nate forcefully cut off my words. Jennifer just closed her eyes and shook her head over and over. Even if the patient's family asked you, the fact remains that you caused the patient's death. No, it wasn't me. Enough already. Dr. Miller stopped me and Nate, lacking strength. Of course, I want to believe you, but there's already too much evidence. I can't cover for you anymore. Sir, please believe me. This is some kind of mistake. Haven't I been devoting my everything and contributing to this hospital all this time? I acknowledge your contributions. That's exactly why I nominated you as the next director. But we've also obtained testimony from the patient's family you were in charge of. They said you were definitely the one in charge and that the money was handed to you. That's ridiculous. Nate mocked me. Dr. Miller hung his head, and Jennifer trembled, not trying to meet anyone's eyes. I felt like the floor beneath my feet was crumbling away. I was innocent. I knew that better than anyone. But in this place, everyone was only trying to bring me down, and even Dr. Miller wouldn't believe a single word I said. After that, perhaps due to the shock, I can't remember much. The patient didn't press charges with the police, and Dr. Miller said he would settle things quietly in light of my past achievements. But there's no stopping people from talking. This scandal of a rare surgical genius spread in an instant to colleagues and patients alike. No matter how skilled I was, there would no longer be any hospitals that would hire me. I was practically banished from the medical world. The review sites that had once praised me were now overflowing with a complete reversal of words. I looked once and stopped immediately, but it seemed my scandal was being written about amusingly and unimaginably cruel words on internet forums and social media. And a few days after I resigned from the hospital, a familiar nurse quietly told me the truth. At a party, Nate had boastfully talked about how he drove me out. Yes, it was all the doing of Nate, Dr. Miller's son. He may have been after money too, but more than anything, he probably couldn't stand that I was nominated as the next director over him. On March 10th, when I was away attending a conference, Nate used my name tag and impersonated me to deal with the patient. He received a large sum of money from the patient's family, tampered with the medicine, and hastened the patient's death. Jennifer, who prepared the medicine, must have noticed the tampering. However, it seems Jennifer was taken advantage of for having large debts, was given hush money by Nate, and on top of that, was threatened with being fired, so she did as she was told. It was all his scheme. But even after hearing that much, I couldn't bring myself to appeal the truth and prove my innocence. I was just too tired. The medical world, which I believed to be a wonderful job, full of a sense of mission and saving people, easily banished someone who had devoted their life to contributing over a trivial conspiracy. In the end, I was abandoned by the people I believed in. I no longer had the energy to fight. With no wife or children, I had nothing to support me other than work, and for a while, I spent my days holed up in my dimly lit home. Amid that, it seems my parents back home heard the rumors about me. They called me repeatedly. Honestly, it was painful to even talk, but when I somehow answered the phone, my worried mother urged me over and over to come back home once. She was so persistent that if I left her alone, it seemed she would get on a plane and come all the way to New York. Finally giving in, I reluctantly decided to go back to my hometown. Ever since I entered medical school, I had been living solely focused on studying and work, so it had been several years since I last went home. Frankly, going back was painful and tough. I heard that since I became famous as a genius surgeon, my name had unnecessarily spread in my hometown. Naturally, this scandal must have spread too. I couldn't bring myself to willingly go home. What will I do for a living from now on? Even though I still had my medical license, I was practically no longer a doctor. I couldn't even imagine myself doing a job other than being a doctor. With a gloomy feeling, I gazed at the clouds flowing below from the airplane window. Eek! Grandma, hang in there. Then, suddenly, a girl's scream rose from behind me. This scream was so realistic that I lifted my body from the seat I was leaning against and reflexively turned around. What seems to be the matter? A young female flight attendant who had been waiting nearby rushed over. In the seats behind were a girl and an elderly woman, but the woman was limply resting against the seat, lacking strength. It was clear at a glance that she wasn't sleeping. "Is there a doctor on board?" The flight attendant raised her voice with a pale face and started wandering between the seats. "She might be a rookie. She was beautiful, but her expression looked like she was about to cry at any moment, and she was so flustered it was pitiful. Should I come forward? Even though I'm no longer a doctor. Yes, I'm a doctor. Then, a middle-aged man in the seat across the aisle raised his hand and stood up. By chance, there was another doctor on board. I honestly felt relieved and sat back down in my chair. I've always wanted to try this once. While saying something carefree that didn't fit the situation, the middle-aged doctor walked to the seat behind me, looking slightly excited. With this, it should be fine even if I don't respond. Relieved, I secretly peeked behind me out of curiosity. She suddenly started feeling ill. The girl explained in a flustered manner. The middle-aged doctor examined the patient with an easygoing demeanor. She probably choked on the in-flight meal and is having trouble breathing. I can handle this with brute force. Saying that, he lifted the woman's body from behind and strongly patted her back several times. The girl watched with concern, but the woman remained limp. That's strange. How about this? I could tell the doctor was starting to get flustered. He held the woman from behind in an embrace and placed a clenched fist around her solar plexus. It was the posture for the Heimlich maneuver, but the position was wrong. At this rate, I unconsciously unbuckled my seatbelt and stood up. No, that'll break her ribs. Because I suddenly shouted. The doctor, the girl, and the flight attendant all stopped in surprise. I rushed over without hesitation to check on the elderly woman. She had a pulse but seemed unconscious. The Heimlich maneuver couldn't be used in this state. When I looked at the flight attendant, she seemed to be on the verge of full-blown panic. While gripping the elderly woman's hand, she looked at me with a tearful expression. I'm also a doctor, sort of. May I borrow a pen and some disinfectant? I asked calmly and slowly, trying to calm her down as much as possible. The name tag peeking out from under her scarf read Emma. Huh? Yes. Emma sprang up as if jolted, quickly brought a pen and a spray bottle of disinfectant, and handed them to me. I disassembled the pen, took out the inner tube, carefully folded it, and made a pointed transparent tube. Then I thoroughly disinfected the pointed part with the disinfectant. What are you doing with that? Emma watched my handiwork with a perplexed look. She likely has a pneumothorax. She's not breathing spontaneously. Simply put, a pneumothorax is a condition where air is leaking from the lungs. I can say for sure without an X-ray examination, but trying to make her vomit is meaningless now. So I'm gonna forcibly secure her airway with this. Probably no one there understood what I said. I gripped the tube tightly and carefully checked the position of her airway. Then, with all my strength, I swung my arm down and stabbed the tube into the elderly woman's chest. A silence fell as everyone held their breath. I was confident I had stabbed the right spot, but even for me, this was the first time treating with makeshift tools like this. For now, she should be okay if she can breathe with this. Amid the commotion, I tried to return to my seat, leaving the rest to the middle-aged doctor. But at that moment, you're the one from that time. The girl beside the elderly woman shouted. You gonna kill Grandma too, not just Grandpa. Realizing the girl's circumstances from her words, I stiffened in shock. I tried to avert my eyes, but the girl grabbed my arm with all her strength, saying, You can't worm your way out of this. Her hate-filled eyes glared at me, determined not to let me escape. There was no mistake. She was probably the granddaughter of that patient who died in the hospital incident. I had never met her directly, but the incident had caused such an uproar. It wouldn't be surprising if she knew my face from the internet and such. To her, I wasn't even a doctor. I was a hated enemy who let her grandfather die. However, what broke the tense silence was a small exhalation, a huge sound. She's out of danger now, the middle-aged doctor said with relief. The elderly woman's chest was rising and falling slightly in front of him, beginning to breathe. Thank goodness. You've got skills for being young. Just like a god. The doctor seemed to understand his assessment had been wrong and looked a bit embarrassed. The girl still seemed unconvinced but reluctantly let go of me and checked on her grandmother. This is emergency treatment. She needs to be taken to a hospital right away. As soon as she heard those words, Emma, who had been standing there in a daze, dashed off somewhere, and an in-flight announcement soon resounded. Due to a passenger with a medical emergency, this flight will be making an emergency landing at a nearby airport. She must have quickly arranged things with the captain and made preparations for an emergency landing. For a rookie, her judgment was fast. She had been holding the elderly woman's hand the whole time, and while somewhat unreliable as a flight attendant, she seemed to have a good personality. Emma returned immediately after the in-flight announcement. "Thank you very much. Thanks to you, the passenger's life was saved." Perhaps because she had calmed down, she thanked me with a smile, a complete change from earlier. "No, I just did what I could. After this, we'll land at the airport and transport this passenger to the hospital." "Yes, it's better to hurry. About that, I have a very presumptuous request, but since her condition still seems unstable, could you possibly accompany her to the hospital, just in case?" "Huh?" I glanced at the girl without thinking. The girl made a dissatisfied face but didn't seem about to complain. All right. Now that things had come to this, I, who had started treatment, also had a responsibility. Though perplexed, I decided to accompany them to the hospital. The plane made an emergency landing at the airport, let only me, the girl, and the elderly woman off, then returned to its original route. We went straight to the hospital in an ambulance Emma had arranged for us. In the vehicle, the girl remained silent, glancing at me from time to time, but not saying anything. After arriving at the hospital, I explained the situation to the doctor. The elderly woman was taken in for another emergency surgery. The surgery was successful. I watched from afar as a girl clung to her grandmother, crying, after she regained consciousness. The sight of the girl talking to her grandmother in tears was unimaginable compared to when she had confronted me on the plane, her face pale with anger. Seeing her like this, she was just an ordinary girl for her age. It was understandable she had been so adamant, having lost her beloved grandfather to a suspicious death. I'm glad I helped her. I genuinely felt that way. After watching over them for a while just in case, I quietly left the hospital and returned to the airport. But to my surprise, Emma was waiting there. She had changed out of her flight attendant uniform and was wearing a dress. Her hair was down too, making her seem much softer. "Thank you so much for everything this time." She thanked me sincerely, making me flustered. "Let me introduce myself again. I'm Emma. I don't know how to thank you enough for saving the passenger." "No, I really just did what anyone would," I replied. I found out she had booked the next flight for me, so I gratefully accepted. Emma, with a real face, was a bright, talkative woman. She praised my quick action unconditionally, saying it was really amazing and that she respected me, so I didn't feel bad about it. When I complimented Emma on proposing the emergency landing, she blushed bright red in embarrassment. As we chatted while waiting for the plane, Emma and I hit it off. "Let's grab a meal together sometime," she said, and we exchanged contact information before parting ways. It was a bit of an unplanned schedule, but I boarded the plane Emma had booked for me and safely returned to my hometown. When I left New York, my heart had been so gloomy, but now it felt strangely refreshed. I got off the plane at the local airport and went straight home. Perhaps because my expression was surprisingly cheerful, my worried mother seemed relieved. "You sounded like you were about to die on the phone, but you seem energetic somehow, so I'm relieved," she said with a laugh. After that, I talked with my parents and spent a peaceful time without being chased by the clock for the first time in a while. From here on is the story I learned later. After I left the hospital, the elderly woman I helped, Mrs. Kelly, was able to sit up a few days later. The attending physician told her, "You were lucky that a skilled doctor happened to be on the same flight." "I see. Then I must properly thank that person," Mrs. Kelly said, and asked her granddaughter Sarah about me, but of course, she couldn't answer where I was. "I don't know where he went, but he's the one who let Grandpa die," Sarah reportedly said in a spiteful tone. "Would someone like that desperately try to save me like he did?" Mrs. Kelly asked, and Sarah was at a loss for words. Sarah, too, through directly interacting with me, whom she had only known through stories, internally held the same doubts as Mrs. Kelly. And he's a renowned doctor who can give appropriate treatment on the spot in that situation. "I don't know about that, but Grandpa didn't die of natural causes, right? There's definitely something fishy." Sarah probably couldn't easily accept me, whom she had resented as her grandfather's enemy for so long. "There seems to be more to the story," Mrs. Kelly said shrewdly, befitting a wife of a wealthy man. "Around the time I was enjoying a brief respite at my hometown, Mrs. Kelly was discharged from the hospital and immediately began searching for my whereabouts. She contacted the airline and reconfirmed the situation with Emma, and using the White family's financial power, she tracked down my hometown, as I was well known in the media. Having lost my job and feeling exhausted, I decided to stay at my hometown for a while. However, no matter how much it was my hometown, I, who had spent years working day and night, couldn't settle down without working. So I told my parents I wanted to help out with the small bed and breakfast our family runs. Compared to being a doctor, it was easier in the sense that I could sleep at night. And moving my body and talking with guests was a nice change of pace. A few days after I started helping out. "Excuse me," an elegant female voice called from the front door. There weren't supposed to be any reservations today, so was it a walk-in guest? "Yes, welcome," I said as I opened the door, and I was at a loss for words. There stood Mrs. Kelly with a smile, Sarah with a sullen face, and Emma with a troubled expression. "I finally found you. Could you come with me for a bit?" Mrs. Kelly said calmly but with a forceful tone that brooked no argument. The atmosphere didn't allow me to refuse. I was pushed into the luxury car parked at the entrance, and it immediately started driving off somewhere. How did you know I was here?" I asked, unable to bear it any longer in the car, and Mrs. Kelly smiled elegantly. "You're a celebrity, aren't you? And you seem to be close with her too," Mrs. Kelly said, her gaze directed at Emma sitting next to me. I did something presumptuous, but please don't blame her. When I heard she had also been involved at that time, I asked her various things about you and the situation then. Being told that, I couldn't help but glance at Emma, wondering what she had said. Emma shrank back like a scolded puppy. "I'm sorry. I was asked over and over, saying they absolutely wanted to thank you. But I only told the truth." I let out a small sigh. For now, I was relieved that it didn't seem like she had told any groundless lies like last time. As we talked, the car stopped in the parking lot of a well-known high-class restaurant even in my hometown. "Welcome, Mrs. Kelly." Even the waiters and the manager came out to greet us. Despite being quite far from New York, the White family seemed to be VIP customers here too. We were naturally shown to a private room. Overwhelmed by the unfamiliar atmosphere, I passed through the door frame and entered the private room, only to find that there were already guests there. Dr. Miller and Dr. Miller of the hospital I had worked at until recently, his son Nate, and the nurse Jennifer, the three of them. Yes, the three people who had abandoned and framed me. Before the anger I had almost forgotten could well up, the three of them apologized. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Huh? What was going on? As I was bewildered, Mrs. Kelly explained from beside me. I thought it might be presumptuous, but I couldn't bear it if I didn't do this. According to Mrs. Kelly's explanation, her late husband was once called a local notable and a prominent wealthy landowner. However, when relatives heard that Mr. White was hospitalized with little time left to live, they apparently started fighting over the distribution of his inheritance. So the son and his wife, who wanted to receive the inheritance quickly, approached a timid young doctor and asked, "Is there a way to hasten his time of death? We'll pay you handsomely." The troubled young doctor consulted Nate, who was the director's son and his senior. It was then that Nate came up with a scheme to frame me. Seeing it as a chance to kick me down, Nate told the young doctor, "I'll handle the rest," and took over the patient. And using my name tag that I had left behind while I was away, he impersonated me, received the money himself, and pinned all the blame on me. He even went so far as to log into the management system from my computer and fabricate evidence as if I had been in charge of Mr. White, from the chart to the prescriptions. And Jennifer, who happened to be passing by, witnessed this scene. I actually knew. Jennifer explained haltingly, shedding tears. She was dressed plainly and no longer wore those expensive-looking earrings. I had a terrible spending habit and loved brand-name accessories. It got out of control, and I ended up with a huge credit card debt. I tried to pay it back by working night shifts, but I kept buying new things, and it was a vicious cycle. I was tired and miserable. I desperately wanted to get out of debt, so I gave in and accepted hush money from Dr. Nate. When I thought it was an excuse, Jennifer raised her tear-stained face and looked at me. "But after that, when I heard you were forced to quit, I felt so guilty." I did something terrible. I don't think this can heal the wounds you've suffered, but I'll accept punishment even now. So please, let him return to work." Jennifer said. "I'm sorry too. You were telling the truth, but I was fixated on the fabricated evidence in front of me and couldn't believe in you." Dr. Miller also said, "It might be presumptuous to say this, but if it's what you want, would you be willing to work with us again? Our hospital needs your skills." I didn't know how to respond. No matter how much they apologized, my name couldn't be cleared now. As I remained silent, Mrs. Kelly quietly told me from the side, "Your innocence has already been proven. You should hold your head high. I'll make sure it's properly announced to the media, and if anyone tries to hurt you, the White family will crush them with all our might." I had already been shown more than enough of this person's ability to track me down, her financial power, and her authority. Crush sounded ominous, but it was convincing like no other. But why would you go this far for someone like me? I still couldn't fully believe it. Why would Mrs. Kelly do so much for me, whom she wasn't even close to? I had completely lost faith in people. Mrs. Kelly smiled gently at me, as if to encourage me in my dismay. "After all, I'm here because of the life you saved for me. I'd be cursed if I didn't repay you at least this much." I'm ashamed to admit I almost cried a little. "Thank you very much, but please give me a little time." I couldn't possibly give an immediate answer. This situation was too big for me to process right away. I left the restaurant, got back into the luxury car, and returned home. I immediately confessed everything to my parents, told them I was conflicted but intended to accept Mrs. Kelly's offer, and they gave me a push with a smile. "You loved being a doctor so much. If it's what you want, you should go back to being a doctor. That's right. You haven't done anything wrong, so do what you want to do." Even though they said that, I still couldn't quite make up my mind. I received frequent contact from Mrs. Kelly, but I kept putting off replying for days, making one excuse after another. Then one day, I saw my name being reported extensively on an online news site as the genius surgeon struck by a tragic false accusation. The article detailed Nate's crimes and the hospital's response. From that news, I learned that Mrs. Kelly's son and his wife, Nate, and Jennifer had been arrested. In addition to my already well-known name, genius neurosurgeon, in God's hand, the information a hero who boldly saved lives amidst tragedy was added. The news spread across the internet in an instant, and I not only cleared my name but became even more famous. When the media interviews and such had settled down, Emma came to the bed and breakfast alone. I was nearby for a flight, so I dropped by. She said with a slightly flushed smile, completed the check-in process, and stayed for a few days. Even after a few days, she showed no signs of leaving, and I gradually became worried. Is your job okay?" I asked her that a few days after she started staying, while serving her dinner. "No, it's fine." That can't be true. Being a flight attendant must be a busy job. When I pressed her, sensing something was up, she reluctantly confessed that she had come to persuade me on behalf of Mrs. Kelly. "Your name has been cleared, so why aren't you going back to being a doctor?" When I remained silent, Emma leaned in and said, "The medical field needs you. If you don't go back now, when will you ever? Where did your decisiveness from when you saved Mrs. Kelly go?" She was right. By saving Mrs. Kelly, I had realized it. I wanted to be a doctor again. I wanted to save people's lives and help their life. That's what I had been living for. But whenever I thought that, my weak self would whisper from the depths of my heart, "Can trust that was once lost be regained so easily?" "Geez, you keep saying things like that." Emma seemed fed up and showed signs of anger. I thought she might say something like, "I don't care anymore. I'm leaving." But I was surprised by her unexpected words. "I'm not going home until you say yes." Huh? Saying that, Emma completely showed her intention to stay at the bed and breakfast. Moreover, she had apparently talked to my parents without me noticing. "I'll help with the work here, so please let me stay a while longer," she had pleaded. Young, beautiful, smart, and with a bright personality, she recognized my abilities. There was no way my parents wouldn't be swayed, and they completely took a liking to Emma. My mother, in particular, was already acting like a mother-in-law. "I wish she could become our daughter-in-law like this," she started saying, though I couldn't tell if it was a joke or serious. This situation was bad, and I finally got off my heavy rear. I'm going back to New York. When I said that, Emma's face lit up. You're going back to being a doctor, right? Yes. But I'm not going back to my old hospital. I'm thinking of starting my own clinic. That's wonderful. Emma smiled. As much as I hate to admit it, when she smiles like this, I think Emma is truly beautiful. I can go back to New York with you, right? I had no choice but to raise my hands in surrender. After that, I returned to New York and, as I had told Emma, opened a small clinic. My skills quickly gained a reputation, and the clinic, which started small, gradually expanded in scale. As the scale grew, we became short-handed, so I reached out to Jennifer, who had been released from prison and had her work as a nurse. Even though she had once been threatened and framed me, if she hadn't made up her mind and testified, I wouldn't be here today. I wanted to repay her somehow. I still keep in touch with Mrs. Kelly from time to time. When I heard that Sarah had been inspired by me and became a nurse, I felt a bit embarrassed. It seems we'll have a long relationship from now on, Ethan. Mrs. Kelly pressured me, making me unintentionally give her a smile. As for Emma, even though we were still in contact, we were both busy, and Emma was flying around the world, so we hardly met after the incident. We would occasionally remember to contact each other and update each other on our recent situation, that's all. But recently, for some reason, she had started frequently visiting the clinic with flight souvenirs. You've been coming a lot lately. Did something happen? I asked while accepting the souvenir, and Emma mumbled something. If you dilly-dally, someone will steal you away, Ethan, is what Mrs. Kelly said. What was that? It's nothing. I asked her to repeat it because I couldn't hear well. But Emma, who had turned bright red, rejected me with all her might. Oh my, is this a scene of carnage? Doctor, you're so popular. The nurses teased me, seizing the opportunity. To be honest, it wasn't that I hadn't noticed Emma's feelings, but she was a young woman with a future. Maybe I still had a little distrust of people left in me. Unable to fully believe in her, I hesitated. However, that half-hearted state finally ended when I received a call from Mrs. Kelly. Ethan, women have various time limits. Why don't you make things clear soon? Geez, I'm no match for this person. It's rare for you to ask to see me, Ethan. And for the first time, I called out to Emma myself. The observation deck at the airport. I chose a place that seemed convenient for Emma's schedule. I managed to make time between surgeries and snuck out of the hospital, so I was in my usual white coat. In contrast, Emma, who arrived in a dress, was as beautiful as ever, just like the day I met her at the airport. In hindsight, the reason I was able to return to this place in the spotlight was not only thanks to Mrs. Kelly's power, but also because Emma was there. She encouraged me when I was feeling weak and sometimes scolded me, patiently supporting me. I had to respond to her feelings. Emma gazed at the planes taking off. Looking at her, I took out a small cloth-covered box I had prepared from the pocket of my white coat. Inside was a ring. Emma. I called her name for the first time. She turned around with a start. I opened the ring box and held it out. Will you? The words I gathered my courage to convey were drowned out by the sound of a plane taking off. My bad luck, to have an interruption even at a time like this. Just as I thought that, Emma smiled. Yes, gladly.